I invite you to stand for the reading of the Gospel, which today comes from Matthew 16, verses 21 to 28. This is the passage that comes immediately after Jesus has asked, "Who do people say that I am?" And then to the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter has just said, "You are Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And then Jesus says, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus, saying, "God forbid, Lord, this must never happen to you." But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If any want to become my disciples, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? For what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of God is to come with his angels in the glory of the Lord, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of God coming in his glory." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I imagine that if we think about our parents, I imagine we can make a list of the sacrifices that they made in order to be able to raise us. Parents make sacrifices all the time, which us kids didn't know at the time. There were things which happened behind the scenes, decisions or plans, which we were never aware of. It might have been years before we found out that maybe mom decided not to pursue a particular career, or that mom and dad had worked as a couple really hard to be able to patch up a family feud. We as kids didn't understand the sacrifices they were making because we didn't have the right perspective at the time. We may have felt the sting of the decision, never knowing how they had arrived at it. Maybe that meant a cross-country move because of employment. And maybe we had to change schools mid-year. Maybe it was a decision to let grandma live with us, maybe after she had gotten really sick, and maybe that meant changes in the household. Maybe one of us had to leave our room, give up our room. Missing in our perception is the difficulty with which these decisions were made, and the difficulty that they brought to our parents. We may never have seen our parents agonizing over issues of money or of health about one of our family members. We as kids may have been blissfully unaware of all the difficulty that they were going through, their anxiety and their stress. But now as adults, maybe now we have a better sense, don't we? We understand that their decisions were made in that context, and they were made out of love, out of a sense of responsibility for us as a family. That would be true even if we still don't agree with the decision that they made, or if we think, well, times are different now, maybe today that decision would have been different. In our passages for this morning, sacrifices and suffering born out of love are foreshadowed both for Jesus and for Moses. And we read about the pushback which comes from not really understanding the connection with suffering fully. First, we have that one unique, bizarre story that is connected to Moses. Last week we read about Moses being hidden in a basket and let to float on the river and being found by Pharaoh's daughter. Well, we have skipped now a bunch of things. Now we are to a point where Moses is an adult. In the meantime, Moses had learned how he himself was different, how he was of the Hebrew people, even though he was being raised in Pharaoh's household. He had understood that it was no longer safe for him to be in Egypt, and so he had fled. And he was out of Egypt, trying to live life incognito, just as a shepherd in the fields. And he comes across this incredible sight, this not really burning bush, which turned out to be the symbol or the sign of God's presence, and God speaks to Moses. And God explains to Moses that God has heard the cry of God's people, and that God selected Moses to lead them out of Egypt. Now, this was not anything Moses had signed up for. And so Moses is getting nervous about how is that he was supposed to walk back into Pharaoh's household and demand that these people be released from slavery. He got maybe even a little nervous when he imagined how he would have to convince the people that God had sent him to deliver them. He anticipated ridicule, failure, pain. And for what? Because a burning bush was talking to him? Even if it all worked out, how easy could this possibly be? He wondered the amount of pain and anxiety and difficulty this would bring for him, for others, and wondered whether it was worth it. And then in the gospel, Jesus is following up that statement about the statement that Peter made about Jesus being the Messiah with this sobering description of what it meant to actually follow in the path of Jesus. Because Jesus is saying that things would come to a head, and the Messiah would in fact suffer and be killed and be raised from the dead on the third day. And then Peter, always Peter, actually grabs Jesus and gives him a lecture. Grabs Jesus and says, "Lord, this will never happen to you." Although when I read that passage in my ears, it says, "Lord, this will never happen to us." Peter didn't see the need to derail a good thing. Things were going well. Why suffer? The people love you. We like this. But then Jesus rebukes Peter like Peter was possessed, and then gives that one-liner that Christians have been chewing on ever since. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. This meant self-sacrifice. This meant ridicule. This meant death. Is that really what we signed up for? Just as parenting is not about suffering and pain, though in the journey it will come, being a follower of Jesus is not centered on suffering, but is not safe from it. Parenting is about love, and so is following God. It is about God's love for us and how we are to channel that love to all around us. And it is in the path of love where Jesus asks us to put it all on the line for the sake of love. If you're a parent, you know that you would do anything for your child, including putting yourself in harm's way, including making a decision which on the short term will be painful. And what Jesus is calling us to do is to put it all on the line, our very life on the line, if we are serious about being a channel of God's love to the people. Taking up the cross is not about looking for ways to suffer, but it is about loving and welcoming one another, even risking one's own standing, liberty, possessions. language of taking up one's cross is brutal. It is the willingness to sacrifice because we love one another, especially when it's not popular or expedient or convenient or comfortable or safe. And to suffer the consequences for deconstructing one brick at a time a particular power structure that is oppressing a people. It's part of the way we look at ourselves as a congregation. We seek to be a place of community where people are deeply invested in social justice. But taking up a cross isn't about taking a stand. It's about living in that stance. That means creating deep and meaningful relationships with our community. Following Jesus is certainly about feeding the hungry, but it's also about creating a relationship with those who are food insecure in our midst. It means being outraged that people are hungry, that children are going to bed hungry at night. And it's about pushing up against the structures, whatever they might be, which end up rationalizing or even putting the blame of their hunger on the people who are hungry. Living our call to love isn't the cross to bear. That's not the cross. One part of bearing the cross comes from the ways that maybe those around will treat those who are shining the spotlight on injustice, who are making people then question all that makes our community what it might be. It's about the pain that comes from looking behind the curtain. Jesus didn't come to suffer for the sake of suffering. Jesus came to love us. But in the circumstances in which he came, the circumstances of human reality of his time, that love required his sacrifice. Our call to take up our cross is to look at the cost of love with our eyes wide open. And for that challenge, we give God thanks.